The unified coalition of civilized worlds had been losing the war for approximately 14 standard cycles, which was impressive considering they had superior numbers, better technology, and what they insisted on calling tactical superiority. The enemy, colloquially known as the Devourers, because apparently the galaxy had run out of creative naming conventions, were crystalline horrors that consumed matter and converted it into more of themselves. Think space locusts, except each locust was the size of a shuttle and could shrug off plasma fire like it was a pleasant summer rain. The coalition's strategy, refined over centuries of conflicts against rational opponents, involved calculated retreats, defensive formations, and lengthy committee meetings to determine the most ethically appropriate response to being eaten alive. It was all very civilized. It was also spectacularly failing. The Devourers, bless their non-existent hearts, had no interest in negotiation, strategic withdrawal, or filing the proper invasion permits. They simply appeared in a system, consumed everything organic and most things inorganic, and moved on to the next course in their all-you-can-eat galactic buffet. They'd taken 47 colony worlds, 12 military installations, and one very expensive resort planet that the Altharian Diplomatic Corps was still filing insurance claims about. High Command, a collection of the galaxy's finest military minds, representing 8 different species, had determined that what they needed was fresh perspective. Someone to look at the situation with new eyes and provide innovative solutions. What they got was Earth's 3rd Expeditionary Force, which should have been their first warning that this was going to go sideways. Humanity had been part of the coalition for exactly 6 standard cycles, which in galactic terms meant they were still figuring out which bathroom was there. They'd been invited primarily because they had achieved faster-than-light travel and possessed enough nuclear weapons to qualify as a potential hazard to navigation. The coalition's integration protocol involved a lengthy cultural exchange program, sensitivity training, and a thorough review of human military doctrine that had caused 3 separate review board members to require psychological counseling. The human approach to warfare, it turned out, was considered somewhere between barbaric and clinically insane by the rest of the galaxy. They had terms like acceptable losses, scorched earth, and my personal favorite, close air support, which apparently meant calling down explosions so close to your own position that survival was more of a suggestion than a guarantee. The Altharians, whose military philosophy centered on minimizing casualties through careful maneuvering, had taken one look at human tactics and recommended immediate quarantine. The Vrelnoth, who prided themselves on logical combat doctrine, had simply walked out of the brief. But the war was going poorly, and High Command was desperate enough to accept Earth's offer of assistance. They assigned the human contingent to Forward Operating Base ET 7, a military installation in the Outer Drift that was considered relatively safe, which in military terminology meant they only got attacked every few weeks instead of daily. The hope was that humans could provide some tactical input while being kept far enough from the main combat zones that they couldn't accidentally start an interstellar incident. The human marine who would eventually become legend arrived on a cold morning by station standards, though morning was a relative term in space and cold was mostly a function of the climate control system's ongoing passive-aggressive relationship with the maintenance crew. He stepped off the transport with the rest of his unit, carrying exactly 1 duffel bag, and wearing an expression that suggested he'd already assessed every tactical weakness in the station's defensive perimeter, and found them wanting. Base Commander Galeth, a distinguished Farron officer, whose career had been exemplary right up until the moment he'd been assigned to babysit the human contingent, watched them disembark with the enthusiasm of someone greeting a terminal diagnosis. The Farron were tall, elegant beings who approached warfare the way others might approach a chess match: lots of thinking, minimal movement, and a strong preference for not being anywhere near the actual. Galeth had earned his rank through brilliant strategic planning and an impressive ability to retreat in 17 different languages. The Marine snapped a salute that was technically correct but somehow managed to convey a certain skepticism about the entire command structure. He was average height for a human, which made him short by most species standards, built like he'd been assembled from spare parts and bad decisions, with eyes that tracked every movement in the hangar bay. He had the look of someone who'd seen combat and decided the experience was interesting enough to repeat, which was its own kind of insanity. Galeth approached with his second officer, a Vrelnoth, named Ith, who'd been analyzing the human personnel files with increasing alarm. The Vrelnoth were logical to a fault, which meant they had predictably concluded that humans were a statistical impossibility that shouldn't exist, and certainly shouldn't be allowed near weapons. "Welcome to Forward Base set to 7. Galeth said in flawless standard, his translator converting his melodious native tongue into something humans could process without bleeding from the ears. "I trust your journey was uneventful." The Marine's expression suggested his definition of uneventful differed significantly from the commander's. "Sir, transport was adequate. Looking forward to getting oriented." Ith stepped forward, datapad clutched in 3 of his 6 manipulator appendages. "Your combat record is highly irregular. You have survived 14 engagements that Coalition tactical analysis suggests should have resulted in 97% casualties. How do you explain this discrepancy?" The Marine glanced at him with something that wasn't quite amusement. "We didn't read the tactical analysis." There was a moment of profound silence while the aliens processed this statement. The rest of the human unit, standing in formation behind their pointmen, maintained perfect military bearing, while somehow projecting an aura of barely contained chaos. They had that look that made veteran soldiers from any species nervous, the look of individuals who'd been through something that had burned away everything except the essential bits, and those bits were sharp. "You'll be assigned to perimeter defense," Galeth said, recovering his composure. "We'll integrate you slowly into our operational structure. There are protocols to learn, command chains to understand, and a comprehensive manual on Coalition combat doctrine that you'll need to study." The Marine nodded. "Understood, sir. Where are the Devourers most likely to attack?" Galeth blinked, which for a Farron involved 3 sets of eyelids closing in sequence, creating a ripple effect that usually indicated confusion. "That's not relevant to your current assignment. You'll be notified if there's a threat situation." "With respect, sir, knowing where the enemy might kill us seems pretty relevant." Ith's translator made a sound like grinding gears trying to process something offensive. "We have predictive algorithms that calculate Devourer movement patterns with 83% accuracy. When an attack is imminent, you'll be informed through proper channels and expected to follow evacuation protocols." The Marine's expression did something complicated. "Evacuation protocols?" "Yes." The Farron gestured with one elegant limb. "Coalition doctrine prioritizes personnel preservation. We fall back to prepared positions, establish defensive barriers, and wait for reinforcements. It's a proven strategy. How many bases have you lost using this proven strategy?" There was another moment of silence, longer this time and significantly more uncomfortable. Galeth's skin shifted through 3 shades of diplomatic embarrassment, while Ith's translator actually crashed and had to reboot. "That's classified information," Galeth said, finally. The Marine nodded slowly, the kind of nod that conveyed understanding and complete disagreement in equal measure. "Understood, sir. If there's nothing else, we'd like to get settled in." Dismissed. "Report to Barracks 7. Your orientation begins at next cycle's morning assembly." The humans moved out with practiced efficiency, weapons secure, movements coordinated, like a single organism that had learned violence as a second language. The Marine lingered for a moment, looking around the hangar bay, noting exit points, defensive positions, structural weaknesses. His eyes stopped on the emergency bulkheads, traced the power conduits running along the ceiling, assessed the sightlines from the upper gantry. Then he smiled, which somehow made him look more dangerous than when he'd been serious. Galeth watched him go and felt the first stirrings of what his species called drelemoth, which translated roughly as the certainty that one has made a terrible mistake but it's too late to fix it. He was absolutely right, of course. But in his defense, there was no possible way he could have predicted just how terrible, or just how spectacular the consequences would be. The galaxy was about to learn what humanity meant by acceptable losses. It was going to be educational. The Devourers hit Forward Base, ETA 7 exactly 3 days after the humans arrived, which was either cosmic irony, or proof that the universe had a vicious sense of timing. Probably both. The attack began at what the station called 0300 hours. Though time and space was a polite fiction everyone agreed to pretend mattered. The first warning was the sensor grid screaming like it had just discovered mortality, followed immediately by the base-wide alarm that sounded like a dying accordion having an argument with itself. Commander Galeth appeared on every screen simultaneously, his elegant features arranged in what his species considered calm authority, but what actually looked like barely suppressed panic. All personnel initiate retreat protocol, Delta 7. Proceed to emergency evacuation craft in an orderly fashion. This is not a drill. The coalition forces moved with well-practiced efficiency toward the hangar bays, abandoning their posts according to centuries of refined doctrine. They had this down to an art form, really. Defensive positions were evacuated in precise sequence. Equipment was secured according to salvage priority lists, and everyone moved at exactly the regulated pace that minimized stampede risk, while maximizing survival probability. It was all very civilized and completely useless when the enemy didn't care about playing by established rules. The Devourers punched through the outer hull in 7 places, simultaneously, because apparently they'd learned geometry somewhere along the way. They looked like someone had given nightmares physical form, and then asked those nightmares to reproduce aggressive, crystalline bodies that shifted between solid and something that wasn't quite energy. Multiple limbs ending in appendages that could rip through reinforced durasteel like it was decorative tissue paper, and absolutely no respect for structural integrity or personal space. The base's automated defenses opened fire with enough plasma to vaporize a small moon. The Devourers absorbed it, converted it into more of themselves, and kept coming. They moved through corridors like a flood made of malice and bad geometry, consuming everything organic they encountered and leaving behind only crystalline residue that used to be people. The human barracks were in Section 7, which was coincidentally one of the furthest points from the evacuation craft, and closest to 3 of the breach points. Some might call that bad luck. The Marine called it a tactical opportunity, which should have been everyone's second warning that humans and normal species defined words very differently. His unit was awake before the alarms finished warming up, weapons ready, gear secured. They moved to the corridor intersection outside their barracks, and did something that made the fleeing coalition forces stop in confusion. They set up a defensive position, facing toward the enemy, on purpose. A Vrelnoth soldier, fleeing past with admirable speed, paused long enough to gesture frantically. Wrong direction. Evacuation is behind you. The Marine was checking his rifle, a human weapon that the coalition armory had classified as primitive and unnecessarily loud. He looked up with that expression that suggested he'd heard the suggestion, processed it, and decided it was adorable. We know where evacuation is. We also know what happens when everyone evacuates and leaves the Devourers alone with the base reactor. The Vrelnoth's translator made a sound like buffering. That's not our concern. Survival takes priority over installation preservation. Does it? The Marine slapped a magazine into his weapon with a sound that echoed down the corridor. Because I'm pretty sure if they eat the reactor, the explosion reaches the evacuation craft before you get clear of the blast radius. But hey, you do. The Vrelnoth stared at him, complex thoughts visible in compound eyes that had evolved to process 17 types of logical fallacy simultaneously. Then he turned and ran fast. The first Devourer came around the corner approximately 40 seconds later. Moving in that way they had that suggested physics was more of a guideline than a law. It was roughly the size of a combat shuttle, all angles that hurt to look at, and edges that existed in more dimensions than strictly necessary. It saw the humans and made a sound like breaking glass singing opera badly. The Marine fired. Human kinetic weapons operated on a principle the galaxy had abandoned millennia ago. You throw a small piece of metal really fast, and hope it hits something important. It was crude, unsophisticated, and generated enough noise to wake the dead. The Coalition had stopped using them because they were inefficient, required significant resources, and honestly, they were a bit embarrassing for a spacefaring civilization. They also worked spectacularly well on Devourers. The rounds punched through crystalline armor that shrugged off plasma, created fracture patterns that spread like infectious bad news, and most importantly, didn't provide energy that the creatures could absorb and convert. The Devourer staggered, made a sound like a computer crash, and proceeded to have what could only be described as a mechanical seizure. The rest of the human unit opened fire, and suddenly the corridor became a demonstration in why evolution had given humans the bright idea to throw rocks at things that scared them. The noise was apocalyptic. The muzzle flash turned the corridor into a strobe light having a religious experience, and the Devourer, which had been about to consume its way through to the reactor core, decided that discretion was the better part of continuing to exist.
It retreated. Devourers didn't retreat. They consumed or they died trying. The entire coalition military doctrine was based on this fundamental truth. Except apparently no one had informed the Devourers about coalition assumptions, and they definitely hadn't met humans before. The Marine watched it disappear back around the corner, then looked at his unit. "Well, that's new." His second spoke up, a woman who'd been in enough fights to know when tactics were about to get creative. "Think they'll try a different approach? Only one way to find out." He glanced at the corridor the coalition forces had disappeared down, now empty except for scattered equipment and the lingering smell of panic. "Command is going to be pissed we didn't evacuate. Command can file a complaint." He checked his ammunition, noted he'd used less than a quarter magazine. "In the meantime, we've got a base to defend and hostiles that apparently don't like getting shot. Let's see how many more are interested in learning this lesson." They found out quickly. The Devourers, operating on whatever passed for communication in their crystalline hive intelligence, decided to try the human position with more enthusiasm and less regard for self-preservation. They came in waves, testing different approaches, learning from each failed attempt. And the humans, operating on doctrine that made coalition observers require therapy, did something remarkable. They held the line, not by retreating to prepared positions, not by waiting for reinforcements, not by following any protocol that appeared in any manual the galaxy had ever written. They simply decided that this particular piece of corridor was theirs, and the Devourers could kindly go eat something else. When the evacuation craft finally launched, carrying coalition personnel who'd followed proper procedure, they left behind a base that should have been overrun. Instead, they left behind 7 humans, approximately 4,000 spent casings, and a new tactical problem the Devourers had never encountered before, an enemy that was too stupid to know when it was supposed to lose.
High Command received the report about Forward Base Eta-7 with the kind of stunned silence usually reserved for discovering mathematical impossibilities, or finding out your accountant had been embezzling for decades. According to every sensor, tactical analysis and predictive algorithm, the base should have been consumed within 2 hours of initial breach. According to actual reality, which had apparently stopped consulting with the algorithms, the base was still there. More specifically, 7 humans were still there, sitting in a defended corridor junction like they'd decided to homestead it, surrounded by enough crystalline devourer corpses to build a small monument to poor life choice. Commander Galactic, who'd evacuated to the Fleet Command ship along with 97% of the base personnel, stared at the tactical display like it had personally insulted his ancestry. "They're still alive," his second officer observed helpfully.
"Yes, thank you."
"I can see that." Galac's skin shifted through colors that didn't have names in standard, but roughly translated to "I told you this was a terrible idea, and nobody listened. The question is, what are they doing?" The sensor feed provided an answer that raised more questions than it solved. The humans had apparently decided that defense was boring, and had moved to an offensive posture, which in military terminology meant they were hunting Devourers through the base corridors, like the galaxy's angriest exterminators. They'd also started doing something that made coalition engineers weep into their datapads. They were improvising weapons. Humans, it turned out, had a special relationship with the concept of safety regulation. Specifically, they understood safety regulations existed and then proceeded to treat them as interesting suggestions, rather than immutable laws of civilized behavior. The Marine had discovered that the base's industrial fabricator could be convinced, through methods that violated approximately 63 separate treaties, to produce substances that were technically classified as war crimes waiting to happen. He'd created something he called expedient deterrence, which was human military speak for let's make the biggest boom possible using whatever isn't nailed down. The principle was simple. If the Devourers wanted to consume the base, they'd have to consume it while it was actively trying to kill them back. The next major Devourer offensive hit, 6 days later, targeting Supply Hub Tango 4, a critical logistics center that fed 17 forward operating bases. Losing it would collapse the coalition's entire defensive line in the sector. High Command knew this. The Devourers knew this. Everyone knew this, which meant it was about to become a very important piece of real estate. The coalition forces dug in with admirable determination, established their defensive perimeters, prepared their evacuation protocols, and waited for the inevitable. Command had learned from Eta 7 and requested human support, though they'd phrased it more like begging and less like requesting. The Marine arrived with his unit and immediately started doing things that made the base commander require sedatives. He'd brought supplies. Specifically, he'd brought every container of compressed oxygen, industrial solvent and maintenance fuel he could requisition, borrow or creatively redistribute from bases that probably should have noticed their inventory going missing. He'd also brought duct tape, which the Galaxy had independently invented 17 times because apparently some problems were universal. The Altharian base commander, a dignified officer named Fen who'd spent 40 cycles perfecting the art of not dying, watched the humans work with increasing alarm. "What exactly are you constructing?" The Marine looked up from where he was assembling something that looked like it had been designed by someone who'd flunked out of engineering school and decided to specialize in spite. "Defense in depth, sir. That looks like a bomb." "It's not a bomb." The Marine sounded offended. "Bombs are crude. This is a precisely calibrated area denial system." "What's the difference?" "Bombs explode randomly. This explodes exactly when and where we want it to." Fen's translator made a sound like having an existential crisis. "The Devourers consume energy. Your device will simply feed them." The Marine smiled that smile again, the one that suggested he'd thought about this problem longer than was strictly healthy. "Plasma feeds them. Heat they can convert feeds them. But rapid oxidation combustion happening faster than their conversion rate can process." He patted his creation affectionately. "That just ruins their whole day." The Devourers hit the base in force approximately 4 hours later. They came in numbers that made the previous attacks look like scouting parties. Hundreds of the crystalline horrors moving in coordinated patterns that suggested intelligence considerably higher than Coalition analysts had estimated. They'd learned from their encounters, adapted their tactics, and brought enough biomass to consume the base twice over. They hit the outer defenses like a wave of geometric nightmares, and did what they always did: absorbed the plasma fire, converted it to energy and kept coming. Coalition forces fell back according to doctrine, fighting withdrawal to secondary positions, everything by the book. The humans did not fall back. The humans, in what was becoming a disturbing pattern, had apparently misplaced their copy of the book and decided to write a new one using crayons and When the Devourers breached the inner perimeter and started consuming their way toward the supply depot, they found the Marine standing in what should have been an indefensible position, surrounded by his improvised deterrent systems. He was smiling. This should have been their warning to try a different approach. He triggered the first device when they were 10 meters out. The explosion wasn't the clean plasma detonation of Coalition weapons. It was dirty, chemical, the kind of fire that humans had used to burn things since they'd discovered that rubbing sticks together could create. It spread faster than the Devourers could convert, consumed oxygen in a chain reaction that turned the corridor into a preview of whatever hell looked like, and most importantly, generated heat at a rate that overloaded their absorption capability. The Devourers made a sound like breaking glass having regrets. They tried to retreat, adapt, do anything except be where they currently were. The Marine triggered the second device, then the third, creating a cascade of chemical fury that turned tactical withdrawal into a routed retreat. Coalition forces, watching from their defensive positions, saw something they'd never witnessed before: Devourers running away, not tactically repositioning, not strategically withdrawing, actually fleeing like someone had just shown them something that violated their understanding of how the universe was supposed to work. The Marine walked out of the smoke and chemical fire, slightly singed, completely unrepentant, carrying a weapon that was technically classified as illegal in 47 systems, and functionally classified as insane in the rest. He looked at the stunned Coalition soldiers, then at the retreating Devourers, then back at the soldiers. "Anybody else want to evacuate?" he asked. "Because I'm just getting started." Nobody evacuated. For the first time in 14 cycles, Coalition forces held a base against a major Devourer offensive without losing ground, personnel or their lunch. They held it because one human Marine had looked at the established tactical doctrine, decided it was inadequate, and replaced it with controlled insanity and chemical warfare. High Command received the report and made a decision that would echo through galactic military history. They promoted the Marine, gave his tactics an official designation, and started teaching other units how to think like humans. It was either the best decision, or the worst decision they'd ever made, possibly both simultaneously. Definitely terrifying. The legend spread through the Coalition fleet faster than any official communication could have managed, which was impressive considering they had faster-than-light communication networks, and the legend had to rely on soldiers gossiping between ships. Within 2 weeks, every military installation in 3 sectors had heard about the human Marine who'd looked at overwhelming odds, laughed and then set those odds on fire using materials he'd technically stolen from maintenance. The stories got bigger with each retelling, as stories did. By the time they reached the outer colonies, he'd single-handedly destroyed a Devourer hive ship, using nothing but duct tape and aggressive optimism. In the inner systems, they claimed he'd stared down a Devourer swarm and convinced them to leave through sheer force of personality. The Vrelnoth, who prided themselves on logical accuracy, had stopped trying to correct the misinformation, because honestly, the truth was almost as unbelievable. High Command, displaying the kind of wisdom that only comes from desperate circumstances and exhausted alternatives, promoted him to tactical advisor. This was their polite way of saying, we don't understand what you're doing, but please keep doing it, and maybe teach others before we all get eaten. The promotion came with an office, a staff position, and the expectation that he would translate human combat doctrine into something the rest of the galaxy could understand without requiring psychological support afterward. It was an impossible task, which was probably why they gave it to him in the first place. His first official briefing to Coalition command staff became the stuff of legend itself. He stood in front of a room containing the galaxy's finest military minds, individuals who'd spent centuries perfecting the art of warfare, and proceeded to explain human tactics using terms like acceptable losses, calculated risks, and my personal favorite, aggressive negotiation. A Farron admiral, whose species had written the definitive text on strategic withdrawal, raised one elegant appendage. You're suggesting we deliberately place ourselves in disadvantageous positions to draw enemy forces into traps. The Marine nodded. It's called works on fish, works on Devourers. That's suicide, only if you lose. The silence that followed was the kind that makes historians take notes, because someone's about to say something that changes civilization. An Altharian general, who'd commanded fleets in 6 major engagements, and survived them all through careful planning and better luck, leaned forward. Your species has a death wish. The Marine considered this with the seriousness it deserved. No sir, we have a living wish. It's just more aggressive than yours. Other species started adopting human-inspired tactics, with results that ranged from spectacular success to why did we think this was a good idea. The Vrelnoth, logical to a fault, tried to systematize human improvisation, and created something they called calculated chaos theory. It worked approximately 60% of the time, which was better than their previous 0%. So they declared it a victory and added it to their tactical database. The Farron attempted aggressive defense, and mostly succeeded, though they insisted on renaming it strategic forward positioning, because aggressive made them uncomfortable. The Altharians tried controlled fury and discovered that fury was significantly harder to control than they'd anticipated, but the Devourers didn't know that, so it worked anyway. The Marine himself continued doing what he did best, showing up at critical battles, violating safety regulations, and making the Devourers regret their life choices. He accumulated a collection of official reprimands and unofficial medals that made his service record look like someone had fought a war with bureaucracy and won. The Devourers, for their part, started avoiding sectors where humans were stationed. They'd developed something that their crystalline intelligence recognized as pattern awareness, and what Coalition analysts called learned avoidance behavior, but what really amounted to the galaxy's most dangerous predators, looking at humans and deciding maybe easier prey existed elsewhere. The war didn't end with a grand battle or treaty signing. It ended gradually, with the Devourers pulling back to their original territories, and the Coalition realizing they'd spent 6 months not losing ground. Not losing eventually became winning, which in military terms was close enough to count. Commander Galactic, promoted to fleet coordinator as a reward for not getting the humans killed, found the Marine one day in the observation deck of the command ship.
The human was watching the stars with that expression that suggested he was either deep in thought or calculating blast patterns. With humans it was impossible to tell. We've been analyzing the tactical shift, Galactic said, settling into what humans called comfortable silence, and what Farron called awkward social obligation. The Devourers show avoidance patterns specifically correlated with human presence. They've learned to fear you. The Marine didn't look away from the stars. Fear's a strong word. Let's say they've learned respect for species that don't know when to quit. Your tactics shouldn't work. They violate every principle of civilized warfare. Maybe that's the problem. The Marine glanced at him with something that might have been amusement. You spent so long making war civilized that you forgot what it actually is. It's not a chess match or a negotiation. It's survival with extra steps and bigger explosions. Galac's skin shifted through thoughtful color. We invited your species to provide fresh perspective. I don't think we understood what that meant. Usually doesn't mean what people think it means. The Marine turned back to the viewport. You wanted someone who didn't know the rules well enough to follow. Congratulations. You got exactly what you asked for. And now other species are learning to think like humans. Galac's tone suggested he wasn't sure if this was progress or apocalypse. We're teaching the galaxy to be more like you. The Marine smiled, and for once it wasn't the dangerous smile. It was something closer to genuine amusement, mixed with understanding. Here's the thing about human tactics, Commander. They work because we're too stubborn to accept impossible, and too stupid to recognize when we're supposed to lose. You can teach the methods, but the mindset, he shook his head. That takes generations of evolution on a planet that spent millions of years trying to kill us. You don't learn that in a classroom. Then what do we do? The Marine shrugged. Keep improvising. Keep adapting. Keep refusing to lose. Eventually you'll figure out your own version of crazy. Just make sure it's the kind of crazy that wins wars instead of the kind that loses them spectacularly. He left Galactic standing there, watching the stars and contemplating the irony of the situation. The galaxy had spent millennia developing sophisticated tactics, advanced weapons and civilized approaches to warfare. Then one species showed up with chemical fires, improvised explosives, and the unshakable conviction that retreat was for people who lacked imagination. And somehow, improbably, impossibly, it worked. The unified coalition of civilized worlds continued their war against the Devourers with renewed confidence, human-inspired tactics, spreading through their forces like a particularly aggressive. They won battles, held territory, and slowly pushed back against the crystalline nightmare that had consumed 47 colony worlds. The Marine became a legend, his name spoken in reverence and mild terror across 8 species and countless installations. They told stories about him in training academies, analyzed his tactics in war colleges, and generally treated him like he'd discovered fire for the second time. He didn't particularly care about the fame. He just showed up where the fighting was worst, brought his improvised deterrence, and refused to accept that losing was inevitable, which when you thought about it, was the most human thing possible. The galaxy had learned what humanity meant by acceptable loss. It meant that losing wasn't acceptable, and they'd burned down the universe to prove it. They'd learned what humans meant by tactical withdrawal. It meant advancing in a different direction, preferably towards something explosive. They'd learned what humans meant by civilized warfare. It meant warfare that you survived long enough to remain civilized afterward. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The coalition had invited Earth to provide fresh perspective on their losing war, hoping for innovative strategies and clever solutions. What they got was one Marine with more audacity than sense, a talent for creative violence, and the absolute conviction that rules were suggestions for people with insufficient imagination. And somehow, impossibly, that was exactly what they needed. Funny how the universe works sometimes.